is a historical piece, and I have taken to sharing this once a year on Confirmation Sunday, some words from Methodist founder John Wesley, namesake of this church, on the character of a Methodist. John Wesley was a person who believed that not only was it important to be a person of faith, but the quality of faith really mattered, that there were some particular traits that he wanted to cultivate in the Methodist people, things like spiritual humility, the fact that you could be a person of deep faith and still know that you've got more to, when it comes to the deep things of God, there's always more to know. And a sense of being willing not to divide up over doctrinal differences, but to partner with anybody of goodwill who seemed to have the love of God in his heart, or her heart, wanted to be a person who's willing to cooperate and look past small differences in order to embrace the love of God. Here's Wesley's character of a Methodist, just some excerpts from the 1740s. The distinguishing marks of a Methodist are not his opinions of any sort, his assenting to this or that scheme of religion, his embracing any particular set of notions, his espousing the judgment of one man over another, are all quite wide of the point. We believe Christ to be the eternal supreme God, but as to all opinions which do not strike at the heart of Christianity, we think and let think. We do not desire to be distinguished by the use of any particular religious expressions. The most obvious, easy, common words where we can convey our meaning we prefer, both on ordinary occasions and when we speak of the things of God. Our religion does not lie in the form of our apparel, in the posture of our bodies, in the covering of our heads, or abstaining from marriage or meats and drinks, which are all good if received in thanksgiving. What then is the mark? Who is a Methodist, according to my account? I answer, a Methodist is one who has the love of God shed in his heart as the Spirit gives to him, one who loves God with heart and soul and mind and strength, God as the joy of his heart, the desire of his soul. By these marks we distinguish ourselves from the unbelieving world, but from persons of faith, whatsoever denomination they may be, we earnestly do not desire to be distinguished at all, nor from any who sincerely after what they know to be true and have not yet attained. Do you love and serve God? It is enough. I give you the right hand of fellowship. Then turning over to the Old Testament, here are two readings today. First from the book of Exodus, some selections from the 15th chapter. Hear this word. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea. His picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them, and they went down like a stone. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing, and Miriam sang to them, Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. Then Moses ordered Israel to set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness, and they found no water. And then from the prophet Micah, hear this word. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Grant, O Lord, that we might be the masters of ourselves to become the servants of others. Take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire for Thee. Amen. Well, unless you listen pretty closely, it would be easy to miss. But that passage I read you this morning from Exodus records what I think really is one of the most momentous events in the whole Bible. You could think of a lot of things that would be on the short list in terms of history's greatest moments. You know, think of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, or the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, or the discovery of penicillin for treating illness. You could make a list of momentous historical events, I suppose. But right up there, in my opinion, with all of those things is what we heard from Exodus 15. The Israelites escaping slavery in Egypt and making their way to the far shore of the Red Sea. It was a decisive move, and it would shape the whole character of God's people, both our Jewish brothers and sisters and the Christians who would come after them. A momentous day when they, with Moses leading, broke from their captors in Egypt, and it looked as if they were going to be caught. The Egyptian army, hot on their heels, the Egyptian army, most powerful army in the world at that time, and just at the moment when they needed it the most, God provided them the way. The Red Sea parts, you remember the story, and the Israelites make it to the far shore, and their pursuers then are drowned when the walls collapse back in around them. And the reading from Exodus 15 is the record of that. They have made it, and they have just stopped breathlessly on the far shore of the Red Sea. Moses, who is not really known to history as all that celebratory a person. You know, Moses could be pretty cranky, both with the Israelites and sometimes with God himself. Moses himself can't help but break into song. Oh, sing to the Lord, he says, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. A huge moment in the biblical narrative. And for the rest of Exodus 15, it's all about, so everybody is celebrating. They play tambourines and they dance and they relish the fact that they have crossed what they assume to be the finish line. Until finally, at the end of the chapter, somebody looks around and kind of in the midst of all of the partying and celebration, he taps Moses on the shoulder and says, "Hey, do you see where we are now?" They have escaped, but now they are in the wilderness. Nobody's chasing them anymore, but all of a sudden, they find themselves in a new challenge, a place that is untracked, barren. There are no provisions there. And at the very end of the chapter, it dawns on them for the very first time that even though they have reached one key moment of arrival and achievement in escaping bondage, they're by no means done. And in fact, though they don't know it yet, they will spend the next 40 years in the wilderness of Shur. That's like the rest of their whole adult lives in trying to get through that wilderness to the promised land. I have to say, I couldn't help but think of that story this week as I contemplated the fact that this is a milestone week Sunday in so many ways. Our confirmands and our seniors, they have done something very decisive and important. They have made their way through the Red Sea and got to the other shore. And first thing we need to say is we affirm that. What a wonderful thing it is. To our seniors, you really are at a new point in life. You have made the journey through, and it's absolutely right for you and for all of us with you to break out the tambourines and celebrate today. You have had the perseverance, the commitment required to complete something important in your life. And we all know that that is a determination. Kathy's doing a series with the young people on determination this week, but It's for all, determination for all of us is a quality, one of the key components of character that help us live a life that is deep and the kind of faithful life we would want to live. It's interesting to think Jesus talked a lot about determination. He talked a lot about perseverance and how staying power in life is not the same as starting power. It's one thing to get started. I go to the Shirk Center fairly often, and one of the things that I know, and if you're in a health club, maybe you know this too, health clubs are teeming with people the first 2 weeks of January after the New Year's resolutions, right? But this time of year, by now, it's thinned out pretty good. Starting power and staying power, not the same thing in any realm. And Jesus talked a lot about determination. You remember he told that parable about the king who, he said, what king, if he was contemplating going to war, wouldn't first decide if he had enough troops to finish the job, or else he'd get started in the fight and find himself forced to surrender midway, hat in hand, because he didn't have the power to stick it out. Or the other story he told you, remember this story about the man? He said, what man who, if he's going to build a tower, he doesn't count the cost first, lest he run out of materials and money halfway through, becomes the laughing stock of town. To be able to follow through on your commitments and having the emotional toughness to see a worthy goal through to a good conclusion. That is worth celebrating, and it's something I would remind you Jesus valued greatly. And it makes sense that he would value it in that way, because sometimes, endurance is the only thing we have to give when life is taking us through some struggle and we aren't sure how long it's going to be until we see the light at the end of the tunnel. So we begin today, on behalf of the church, let me say to our graduates, and next service I'll say it to our conference, well done to have completed this important piece of being a person of depth and character. We're proud of you, and we recognize that what you've completed here for our confirmands in their life of faith and for our graduates in their intellectual development, among the most important things you can do in your life. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that the Bible, in all of its wisdom, would have us know that as important as milestones like this are, they are never finish lines. Life is a process, and so often, like the Israelites, we get over one hurdle only to see that we've now entered into a new wilderness, and we have to learn new things and meet new obstacles that come our way, no matter how well prepared we may think we are. Years ago, Lori and I had a friend named Greg. He was in college with us out in the University of Denver. And from a very young age, when he was in his early 20s, he knew what he wanted to do with his life. His goal was to become a professor of psychology. That was the far side of the Red Sea for him. And he was smart, and after graduation, he finished his bachelor's degree, went immediately off and excelled in graduate school, went to UCLA, got a PhD with distinction there, and landed a teaching job, tenure track, assistant professor of psychology at Bowling Green State University in Kentucky. It was like everything he wanted, he had attained. But the reality was that he was only there a few months. He started in the fall, and a few months later, the disillusionment began to set in. He sent us a Christmas card. We thought it was just going to be, Merry Christmas, your friend Greg, but it was this long letter in there, and it kind of outlined his disappointment. He said, my students, so many of them, I work so hard on my lectures and they come, but they don't seem all that interested in learning. They just want the credit. They want to do it the easiest way and get through. And so many of them disappoint me. And my colleagues in the department, they're kind of aloof and competitive, and they didn't really, I felt like I'd given my all to get this degree, and they don't really value it all that much. And in that note to us, just a few months after his career, the long-sought goal that he had attained, he said, maybe I need to look for a place where my interests and my abilities will be held in higher esteem. And when I read that, I thought, if Greg finds a place where every student always has pure motives, and his colleagues never compete. And I hope he'll tell me where that is, because I want to work there too. Sometimes you achieve only to find yourself in the wilderness. No job. No job will be perfect. For our new graduates, you already know that. But no school that you attend will be the perfect holy grail. For the confirmands, no church going to be perfect church, because it's comprised of people, right? And people are filled with imperfections and mixed motives. And sure enough, no matter what you pursue next, there will be something there that frustrates you. And yet, I have good news to bring. The good news the Bible dares to tell us is that you don't have to despair about this reality, that life is one challenge after another. The good news the Bible would tell you is that it is in the wilderness and not beyond it that you meet God, and that God is present in your life. That's the whole point of what I want to say today. When the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, and they found themselves now stranded in the wilderness, now facing the next challenge that looked, for many of them, a lot worse than the one that they just escaped, right? There were many times where they say, gee, maybe we should go back to Egypt. At least we got fed 3 times a day there. Well, should we maybe go back and surrender? You remember? When they find themselves in their new challenge, they found something else. They found that God was there with them. In fact, out ahead of them. God there to hear their complaints. God to provide them with provisions when their backs were against the wall, right? The manna from heaven when they were about to starve, turning the bitter water into sweet water when they needed the most. God meets them in the struggle and not beyond the struggle, which I take to be profoundly good news. And I want to remind not only our graduates, but all of you and myself with you, that if we take that to heart, that God is present amidst the frustrations of life and not beyond the frustrations, we're free to do a lot more good as God's partner. If we believe that God is really with us and we're in partnership with God, and that no day is so ordinary as not to feel the uplifting strength of God's hand, we're free to live. But our faith all of a sudden becomes not just something we keep in our heads, but the capacity to keep the main thing as we live our life. What does the Lord require? Micah is about as succinct and helpful as anybody in boiling down. If you had to boil down the Bible to one verse, you could do a lot worse than Micah say. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God. To keep the main thing when you're frustrated, because you know you're frustrated, but you're not alone. It's easy to lose sight of that important truth, and it's easy to forget. And when you get up, to ask yourself, what do I want my life to really count for on this particular day, this Sunday, May 21st, 2017? What do I want to stand for in my values? Week before last, I was up in Chicago for 3 days, went to a retreat for members of the Board of Trustees for Illinois Wesleyan University. And the retreat leader for those few days was a delightful guy, recently retired president of the City Colleges of Chicago. And in his opening remarks for us as board members, he said something very simple. He said, one thing I've noticed through the years is that both institutions and individuals very often forget to ask themselves the question, what's my reason for being here today? And then he told a story. He claims it's a true story of a time back in the 1970s, which was when the NASA program was in its heyday. NASA was one of the most effective institutions in the world. It was the time, you remember, the Apollo program, and they'd had these many successful moonwalks, and they had that dramatic and amazing rescue of Apollo 13 when it went bad. They were able to rally and adapt and figure it out and get those people back safely. NASA, our presenter said, was like the pinnacle of institutions in the 1970s. They were doing amazing things. They were so good, our speaker said, that at one point a university consortium sent a consultant down to Houston to NASA headquarters just to see what do they do right at NASA that they're so effective. And the consultant had an appointment to meet with some of the NASA brass, but he got there a few minutes early. He checked in at the main door, hung up his coat, and asked where he could find the restroom. The story is he goes into the restroom and he sees a custodian there happily at work cleaning the mirror and the counter in the restroom. And he's there, and being a consultant, he asks a consultant-like question. He says, "Hey, you mind telling me, how long have you worked here at NASA?" The man says proudly, "I've worked here, sir, 11 years. He said, "Well, would you mind telling me, what's the scope of your work?" He says, "Sure, I can tell you the scope of my work. I come here every day, sir, to help put a man on the moon." And the consultant said at that moment, he kind of understood why NASA was so effective, because from the top to the bottom of the job descriptions, everybody knew what they were about. We're here to help put a man on the moon. It makes all the difference in the world, he said, to have clarity in yourself and in your institutions of which you're a part as to just why you get out of bed every day. And today, really, as we celebrate achievements, it's a day to remember that. You know, beyond the achievements of the moment, we have staying power because we know whose we are and therefore why we exist. To love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. To do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly. Martin Luther, the great Protestant founder, way back in the 1500s, said, really in the church we need to remember we're all priests. Every believer, he called it the priesthood of all believers. Every believer is a priest because every one of us is called to get up out of bed with the assurance that in some way today we have the power to speak a word for God, to kind of preach a sermon, if you will, with your life in some way or other. Sometimes that's hard to imagine, I know, but the truth is God created us, and we have within us, no matter who we are, nothing less than that image of God and this calling to live every day as God's partnership. I'm going to close today with a little video prayer for our graduates that came out just this week from the General Church office in Nashville. I came across it. I thought it was a kind of a wonderful way to conclude this time as we celebrate your achievements and look forward to the ways in which God will be leading you forward, both in all of life's joys and some of its frustrations. But before I run that, I want to close with my favorite benediction, something I heard years ago. I attended an ordination service for a friend of mine, and when it was all done, the bishop who'd done the ordination gave this benediction that's my all-time favorite. It goes very simply like this. Remember, you are enough. I know that you know that, but I charge you never to forget it. You do not need to be someone else. You don't need someone else's talent, someone else's intelligence, somebody else's charm, wealth, or luck. As God's child, you are enough to make a difference. So go out into the world and be yourself. So may it be for us all. Amen. Will you run that, Rusty?